not unique to the other people I discuss on my channel, in that to the outside world and people that knew him or knew of him, he seemed like the last person that you would suspect could be possible of particularly heinous crimes. You know, this guy was actually so approachable and had such a sort of jolly vibe that he was hired to play Santa at the local mall, and kids would come up and sit in his lap and take a picture, and you know, he'd give off just this wonderful vibe. But Bruce had an actually kind of troubled life. He was a gay man who grew up in a pretty conservative household in rural Canada, and he actually got married as well and didn't actually get outed as gay until one of his ex-lovers apparently, you know, exposed the whole thing to his wife. He then ended up in middle age living in an apartment complex in Toronto, where he ended up engaging in some of the most notorious crimes that have been documented in Canada. And trust me, Canada has got some pretty sick killers, but this guy was one of the scariest, and also one of the most interesting to dissect, with some questions that I feel need to be asked. So Bruce McArthur, full name Thomas Donald Bruce McArthur, was born on October 8th, 1951 in Lindsay, Ontario. In addition to raising Bruce and his sister, his parents actually fostered troubled children from the Toronto area. And a young Bruce attended a one-room schoolhouse outside of Woodville, and a classmate recalled him being a teacher's pet and, you know, a bit of a telltale by the other boys, and he didn't fit in with them at all. He was also known for winning singing contests, and his mother was Irish Catholic and his father was a Scottish Presbyterian. So Bruce was gay, we figure out the more time goes on and we hear more about his story. But it's interesting if you see sort of his experience in school. He didn't fit in an all-boys school. And to make matters worse, he had a pretty strict father who Bruce said that he sensed that Bruce was gay. And it is hinted that Bruce had trouble accepting his sexual orientation or the fact he was different, because it would have been seen as abnormal in rural Ontario at that time. And then he went to secondary school in a nearby place called Fenelon Falls Secondary School. And that's where he met a girl named Janice Campbell, who he began dating. And they both graduated in 1970. And he married her when he was 23. So Bruce and Janice embarked on this married life. And it all sounded very white picket fence, normal, you know, middle class America kind of lifestyle, apart from the fact that Bruce was gay. And that made sort of an interesting dynamic to the whole situation, because you could see as time went on, things started to crumble down. Bruce began working for a department store as a buyer's assistant around 1973 in downtown Toronto building that was later demolished for the construction of the famous Eden Centre. And a few blocks north where he was working, a gay village was forming on Yonge Street between, I think that's how it's pronounced by the way, Yonge Street, between College and Wellesley Streets. And same-sex adult sexual behaviour ended up becoming decriminalised in 1969, which is crazy when you think about it now in this day and age, that it used to be illegal to be gay. And Bruce left his job in 1978 and began working as a travelling salesman. By 1979, Bruce and his wife moved to a house in Oshawa, and by 81 they had a daughter and a son, Melanie and Todd. And Bruce started to become very active in his church, keeping himself busy to avoid having to deal with his quote-unquote homosexual feelings. But there's only so much that church can do, basically, and by the 1990s, Bruce began having sexual affairs with men. And a year later, he came out of the closet to his wife, but they continued living together. And I actually read somewhere that it was one of his lovers, one of his flings, that exposed his, double life, and the fact that he would have rather been in a romantic relationship with a man and was doing this, behind his wife's back. So they continued living together. And you have to be honest that this, even though they continued living together because of financial stuff and because of the kids probably, and because maybe, of course they loved each other and it was hard for them to go their separate ways after so long, it must have took such a huge toll on the relationship. And sometime after 1993, Bruce actually lost his job and the couple faced great financial difficulties. So it sounded like a lot of things piled up at once. And there was also legal issues connected to their teenage son, Todd, who was obsessively making obscene phone calls to women that he did not know. So that's weird. Could it be that Todd was acting out in some sort of way because of, all the madness that was happening at home? Who knows? But this, all of this had such a bad effect on the family, and the couple ended up mortgaging their home in 1997 and declaring bankruptcy in 1999. And also in 1997, by the time they mortgaged their home, Bruce and his wife actually separated and he moved to Toronto, as there was no gay community in Oshawa where they were living at the time. And he frequented the bars of Church and Wellesley, Toronto's gay village, and moved into an apartment on the Don Mills Road while pursuing a 4-year relationship with another man. But when they broke up and his divorce was finalised, Bruce actually went to go see a psychiatrist and was prescribed Prozac for several months. And then he began working as a landscaper. So I think it's interesting to note that Bruce went through that period of depression where he was prescribed Prozac just after his divorce was finalised. It's where it gives me, food for thought about why he went down the path that he did. I wonder, did Bruce sit and wonder, because his life ended up kind of a mess, and did he sort of misplace his anger from maybe a society that never let him be himself in the first place to maybe basically who these feelings that he was feeling were projected onto, or even his own sort of homosexuality and gayness itself. Like, if you think about it, his life ended up a mess in a lot of ways because he didn't have the opportunity to be honest with himself, or in his own sort of like religious upbringing and the way he was brought up. Was it sort of like a loathing for his gayness and for gay feelings and for possibly other gay people, which we'll get into in a moment. So in Halloween 2001, just a few weeks after his 50th birthday, Bruce followed actor and model Mark Henderson into his apartment building after being invited into the apartment to see his Halloween costume. Bruce ended up striking Henderson several times from behind with an iron pipe that he often carried. Henderson did fight back before losing consciousness, and he called 911 when he awoke and was taken to St. Michael's Hospital. He suffered a lot of injuries and needed several stitches on the back of his head and also 6 weeks of physiotherapy. Bruce turned himself in after the attack and said he did not remember the incident or why he might have done it. He pleaded guilty to charges of assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm, and on April 11, 2003 received a conditional sentence of 729 days. So it's basically 2 years, a day short of 2 years. And a further charge of carrying a concealed weapon that he took out at the time. And what's really interesting is that the attorney believed that jail time was warranted, but they gave him a conditional sentence because his psychiatric report suggested that he was at a low risk to reoffend. And the victim was traumatized by the incident, but did not provide a victim impact statement for the sentencing. And there were concerns that Bruce's unexplained behaviour may have been due to a combination of different medications he was on, and also something that he would have took before engaging in sexual intercourse, basically a muscle relaxant. So that's interesting. He got away with going to prison and was sentenced to a sentence under house arrest, followed by a 6-month curfew and 3 years of probation. And he was actually barred from church in Wellesley, which were the village, the gay village and everything, except for work and medical appointments, and had to stay 10 meters away from the victim's home or workplace, and was also ordered not to be able to spend time with male prostitutes, and also unable to possess a firearm for 10 years. So that was, really interesting, because that was a situation where it was clear that Bruce had these violent tendencies towards other gay men, which I thought was kind of interesting. It also showed that, he had a bit of an anger problem, which he actually ended up undertaking psychological and psychiatric counselling for. So in 2002, while the assault case was going before the courts, Bruce actually registered with Recon, I think it's called, which was a gay fetish dating website for men that were into BDSM. And his profile noted his interest in submissive men. And he was actually active on numerous gay dating websites. And some of them include Grindr, Daddy Hunt, and Growler. And he joined Facebook in 2011 and catalogued his nightlife with pictures of parties, vacations, birthday dinners, and concerts. And there was a couple of young men of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent in several pictures, which is notable and we'll talk about in a moment. And he became a part of the gay community and was a regular at its bars. And he was living on a 19th floor apartment in Leaside Towers in Thorncliffe Park, which was a neighbourhood populated mainly by immigrants, about 5 kilometres northeast of Church in Wellesley, which is the gay part of Toronto. So in 2003, he was pretty much banished from the gay part of Toronto because he was well known and developed a reputation for BDSM. And he told an acquaintance named Robert James about an incident in which he had been asked to leave an actual coffee house, which caused him to knock all the glasses off the counter in a rage, which is showing that he had some pretty intense anger issues. His friend decided to stay away from Bruce, explaining that he had heard disturbing stories about him. And before long, the list of missing victims started piling up around the gay area of Toronto. 5 victims were noted by investigators for similarities, that they were middle-aged, bearded, patrons of the Black Eagle Bar and self-identified as quote-unquote bears, which is gay men with overtly masculine traits such as beards. Another thing that was interesting was that they disappeared over holiday weekends. One disappeared at Labor Day, another after Christmas, and one during Thanksgiving, one on Easter, and one actually after Toronto Pride. And what was interesting as well is that several of the deceased had characteristics that made them more easily victimized, such as the fact that they were moving between temporary residences, or they kept aspects of their lives a secret, so people wouldn't even know where to begin to find them. One of the victims was named Abdul Bizar Fazi, and he disappeared from the gay village, and he was an Afghan immigrant who was living a double life, so basically he wasn't out. And Majid Kayan, pretty much same circumstance. It was actually 2 years later in 2012, gay village and an Afghan immigrant as well, leading a double life. Then there was another Sri Lankan refugee with no family in Canada, and he actually worked alongside Bruce during his landscaping job. He actually employed this guy, and this guy went missing, and the link to Bruce is a little bit too obvious to deny. And then Sarush Mahmoodi, who was a refugee as well, went missing in 2015, or was reported missing in 2015. Andrew Kinsman, who was actually white, but he was actually employed by Bruce McArthur as well, so that's how that link. Then Sela Messin, who was Turkish, Dean Lizowek, who was homeless and a drug user and a sex worker, and Karishma Kumar Kangaratnam, hope I pronounced that right, but he was a Sri Lankan asylum seeker. And unfortunately, when you think about it from a sociological perspective, it was actually Andrew Kinsman's disappearance that was central to Bruce getting caught. And he was the only white man that was in that 5 victims that I just read out to you. And it was because of him Project Prism was created, and the lead obtained was Bruce McArthur, of course. One of the reasons why Kinsman's disappearance was central to Bruce getting caught was that his disappearance was reported within 72 hours. And if it wasn't, crucial evidence could have been lost. And police found Bruce on Kinsman's calendar for June 26th, the same day where he was last seen. So that was an obvious lead. And surveillance video outside his residence showed a person matching his appearance approach a red vehicle. The vehicle did not show a license plate or a clear picture of the driver, but Chrome Siding identified it as a 2004 Dodge Caravan. There were 6,000 other models just like it in Toronto, but only 5 were registered to someone named Bruce. And the only 2004 model belonged to Bruce McArthur. So by late August or September 2017, they matched the van to McArthur's apartment, but it was no longer at his residence. And the police actually managed to go into Bruce's residence and cloned his hard drive and issued a public statement to the LGBT community to warn them about dating apps and also to exercise caution when meeting someone, because basically a serial killer was on the loose. And actually on Bruce's computer, which went through for forensic analysis of deleted files, they found post-mortem photos of the victims that the people that he had murdered, basically. And then it was then that round-the-clock surveillance was put on Bruce with instructions that he should be immediately arrested if he was alone with anyone. So police officers surveyed Bruce's residence, and they actually arrested him after they saw a young man enter his apartment, and they believed that the man's life was at risk, of course. And when they broke into the apartment, they found a young man restrained on a bed. The man was visibly scared, but he wasn't injured. They gave him a fake name in court and everything, but he was from the Middle East and he'd arrived in Canada about 5 years, and he was married and had not told his family that he was gay. He had met Bruce through a dating app, and that they had met for sex several times, but that his relationship with Bruce was a secret, which, to be honest, is the perfect sort of recipe that if Bruce wanted to do something to this man, nobody would know. There'd be no, clue. Before long, they found evidence for the other victims, and Bruce was named the deadliest known serial killer in Toronto and the most prolific gay serial killer in Canada. Unfortunately, though, there was a publication ban ordered on the court proceedings, which meant that there's a limit to the amount of information that we have on them. But basically, a lot of information did come out that the murders were sexual in nature, and 5 included confinement of the victim, and that he kept trophies of his victims, including jewellery and a notebook, and that DNA from 4 of the victims had been found in his van. The prosecutor also said that Bruce sought out and exploited vulnerabilities in other people that made his victims of his crimes difficult to detect, and that he used sex to lure them in, killing many in his bedroom through strangulation. One photograph that they actually found that Bruce took showed a rope around his victim's neck, twisted with a metal bar wrapped in tape, which is completely horrific. And also it was cited that Bruce showed a lack of remorse. He didn't address the court at all the betrayal of his victims, the effect of his crimes on the gay community, and how he had been a grave danger to everyone up to his arrest. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for 25 years, which is crazy if you think he might be able to get parole in 25 years. And his crimes were described as pure evil with no evidence of remorse, and that he would have continued to kill if he had not been caught. but they did say that it was highly unlikely that he would be granted parole. But that's crazy that there's even a chance, if you ask me. So there has been some speculation as to whether the label serial killer fit with Bruce. And the argument for argues that there was a methodical approach to the killings, and he would photograph and retain personal items from his victims, which is a similar pattern to certain types of serial killers. And there was actually similarities made to Dennis Rader in that, you know, the BDSM aspect and maybe sort of like the paraphilic motivation, you know, like kind of like Ted Bundy. And the fact that he would keep mementos of the murders to relive the kill over time shows that his pathology was leaning more towards being a serial killer than a one-off murderer. But one thing about this case that's interesting to me was the thought behind what Bruce did. You know, he was very clever in the people that he picked to be his victims because he knew that they were living double lives or that they didn't have a support system around them. So he really did prey on vulnerable people to commit his, you know, acts of debauchery and live out these serial killer fantasies that he had. So basically, when it comes to analysing the motives of Bruce, you know, there is that evidence that it was paraphilic, that this was what gave him a sexual kick. But I do think it's deeper than that. If you look like I did into Bruce's background, you know, there was a lot of shame that he must have felt for his sexuality, in that it caused a lot of problems in his life from his parents, you know, the fact that his dad was strict and they didn't pick up on the fact he was gay, and he ended up, you know, living in secret and getting married and moving to rural Ontario and starting a family life. But then his white picket fence lifestyle that he created for himself all came tumbling down when an ex-lover of his outed him. So that does speak to me in this sort of like resentment that built up for the objects of his desire. And it's interesting to see as well that, you know, all his victims were people that he was sexually engaged with. You know, I wanted to cover this case as well because I felt like it asked fundamental questions. You know, on my channel, the main point of me making these videos is because I want to ask questions about not only how do these serial killers and psychopaths and, you know, toxic people act, but also what makes them the way they are. This is just my opinion though, but I do think it poses fundamental questions that if Bruce was able to just be himself and live his life the way he wanted to, would he have built up so much anger? You know, when I talked about Ted Bundy as well, you know, there's a lot of speculation about whether his childhood made him the way he was, whether he was just born like that or whether it was paraphilic. In Bruce's case, there is evidence that there was a hatred building up for his victims, just like with Ted. But the fundamental questions are still hard to answer right now, and what possibly could have made Bruce McArthur the way that he was. In my Psychopath versus Sociopath video, it's interesting because the Iceman, you know, he really sort of blamed him going down his path on the things that happened to him in his life, that, you know, he was treated so badly, in his words, that he lost empathy for other people and he really felt pushed into a corner into committing these crimes, which, to be honest, he could have just been saying as an excuse for people to make, you know, to feel sympathy for what he did. Luckily nowadays people don't have to hide who they are and they could live freely, and it makes me wonder, would Bruce have ended up the way he did if he was born, say, maybe 40 years later? I'd like to hear your opinion on it as well. Like, was Bruce, you know, just someone who was born with this sick urge inside him? Was he an angry person who, you know, wanted to take his anger out into the world, like they do say, hurt people hurt people? Or was it just paraphilic? I think it's really interesting, and that's the reason why I wanted to cover this case with you guys today, because it does pose, very important questions to ask about how someone could have found themselves in this situation. As for Bruce, I feel like he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars, and it's good because I do think that he would have been likely to reoffend, but that's just my opinion. So what do you guys think? What was the deal with Bruce? Leave a comment below, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be back again soon. Bye.